Life is like a novel. Part is written by fate, part is by circumstances, but what we ultimately live by is what we write ourselves.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
So this episode comes from a recording session where we invited our cult members to present ideas of their own. Today, She-Wolf. Take it away.
In the small town of Orillia, Ontario, just an hour from Toronto, because everything in Ontario revolves around Toronto, lies approximately 2,000 unmarked graves. What dark secret is the Ontario government hiding? Well, that's why I'm here. But first, what's your poison?
So, what's your poison?
So I'm She-Wolf, and my poison is going to be my Monster Energy Zero Ultra.
I'm drinking the same old coffee. So in a weird way, when it's colder, it's more bitter, and it tricks my brain into thinking that the caffeine's hitting harder.
I love bitter coffee so much that I prefer McDonald's coffee over Tim Hortons. Sacrilegious, I know, but that's just my taste buds.
People get to be all proud about their tolerance for spice. Why can't I be proud for my tolerance of bitterness? I like the bitterness a little.
Once again, this is Postal Poet. I'm actually not drinking or eating anything right now because I have a bladder the size of a thimble, so I have to be very careful.
I'm Rocky. I'm drinking flavored water with Mio, which is like water flavoring, but it comes in little pointy oval cups, kind of like a Ouija pointer shape. They make my water yummy.
I'm a big fan of their lemonade flavor.
That's good.
I am Rental, and I have a lukewarm lime bubbly water.
Ooh.
Love bubbly water. Which flavor are you drinking?
Just plain lime. I know it's LaCroix, not bubbly, but I live for the limoncello flavor.
Sounds so good.
It's so good.
Just a disclaimer for this episode. Because it is part of the story of how these people were treated at the Huronia institution, in playing clips and our discussion of the subject, we will be using very antiquated mental health terms, such as moron, imbecile, retard, retarded, etc. Listener discretion is advised.
So today's story is a very poignant one. The people who rest in this cemetery, their story must be told properly. I'm at the Huronia Regional Center in Orillia. This was a facility for people with emotional and mental disabilities. It's closed now, but the cemetery is still here. And those that rest here, their story needs to be heard.
All your people are out there. Try and understand me, what I'm going through. I've been through a lot. I've been sexually assaulted, sexually abused, physically, emotionally abused. It's just unreal, and you have no idea what it's coming from. But all of these people here at the Huronia, they have been through a lot. That's not even funny. It's not even It's not pretty. That place there, it's horrible. It's disgusting. And the staff, they treated you like crap. Hitting, smacking, pinched, naked. It was naked. I was naked. And everybody was naked too as well. You just have no idea what it's like. I guess a lot of people don't care about the mental retarded people. They died and they just dump it. They don't give a shit. They just dump the body. They don't care. You know? They just don't. That really hurts me. It's like the cemetery here today. Because people who died in here at the Orillia Huronia Regional Center, none of the staff, they're just trying to cover it to the murder. They get away with murder, and they do. And they have baby borns in there too, and they die too. At the baseball field, I saw it, the people burying it there. So it kind of hit me there. It really does. I'm just telling you the fact that this is a horrible place. And I'm telling you the truth. Because there's no way I'm not lying. Because I was there. I was 7 years old. I felt like crap, shit. And it's just unreal.
Today I'm going to be talking about the Huronia Regional Center, also known as HRC. And for my mouth and my brain's sake, because it's a mouthful, I'm going to be just calling it HRC. So in Ontario, there were 16 institutions being run by the Ontario government. These places were all over Ontario. Some of them are North Bay, Gravenhurst, Smith Falls, and HRC, just to name a few of them. In the year 1839, the Ontario government established the Provincial Lunatic Asylum, which housed individuals with various degrees of mental illness and disability. The government of Ontario thought at one point that individuals could be divided into two categories, curable and incurable. A building was erected, and that building still stands today, being used by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. So basically, they thought all these individuals that were not to be seen in public, they could just cure them of all of their ailments. Those deemed curable would undergo a moral treatment and then be sent out back into society, cured of all their illness. The practice fell into decline as a distinct method by the 20th century. So basically, the moral treatment was a kind and gentler, based on psychiatric teachings. That method was done away with because of overcrowding and the misuse of asylums and the predominance of methods such as whipping, beating, bloodletting, shocking, starvation, irritant chemicals, and isolation.
Sounds like the same tools of control that they would use in like penitentiaries, you know?
It actually sounds like what the Nazis would do.
It gets so much worse from here. So hold on to your hats. Definitely these were barbaric and medieval ways of keeping people either in line, or that was their way of curing people.
No, like the morality of all that, like it twists me up inside. A lot of them probably genuinely thought they were doing the best thing possible for those people, but from a modern context, we understand that all they're doing is adding on more trauma and like adding on more pain to an already painful life.
Almost like eugenics.
Spoiler alert, we're getting to eugenics, for sure. When word got out that the PLA was housing people, it was then that it became overcrowded when families, prisons, poorhouses, and professionals started sending their incurable to the facility. So I'm using incurable in quotes because there's no such thing as curable and incurable.
This is the terminology of the times where they kind of labeled you as, this is a person that cannot be reformed, so we just need to contain them.
And all my information is coming from the Remember Every Name website. They give really, really good accounts of survivors. And like, this is basically like the Coles notes of what happened. I couldn't cover this in an hour, can't cover it, because there is just so much that happened.
It says here, remember every name. These words inscribed on the back of this monument are from surviving members of the Huronia Regional Centre. They're heartbreaking. Words like loss. You have no idea. Slave labor. I have a life now. Fly away. Out of the shadows. Never again. I'm not a number. I have a name. I'm not a number. Forget me not. Survivor. Believe our stories. Tear it down. Locked away and forgotten. We will be heard. Memories, injustice, peace. We were abused. If walls could talk. Babies are buried here. Never give up. The pillars represent the full walls of the asylum. The tree and the crows is going to freedom. Remember every name. Good heavens. God bless you. God bless all of you.
And this is just one institution out of 16 in Ontario. And this is not taught in schools. I didn't know about this until I started working in the field, and I started actually working with individuals that lived in the institutions. And so that's where my qualifications come from. I work with people, I support people with disabilities, with mental illness, to live their lives.
The history of how we dealt with mental illness both gives me hope and grief. In ancient societies, if your child had a physical or mental disorder, they would often be just slain or thrown off a cliff. These institutions, they're an evolution, but are they that much better? And like today we have better terms, but we're still failing a lot of mentally ill and disabled people.
And that's exactly why I wanted to do this, is because in some places we still have the institution mentality. Like even the years that these institutions closed, it's not that long ago. 2009 was the last institution to close, and it's this one, HRC.
Christ.
Yeah. There are people that survived and are still alive today. When the professionals and everybody started sending their incurable to the facility, the government had to act quickly, as it was becoming increasingly difficult to like feed, clothe, and care for all these individuals deemed not worthy to be seen in public. The government decided that taking the individuals out of the city was the best idea, sending them to a dilapidated hotel in Orillia, an hour away from Toronto. Bars were installed on the windows to prevent people from escaping, and the building was only able to house 150 people and soon became inadequate and was closed in 1870. So this building became overcrowded, and then they went in there and they're like, we can't do this anymore. But then Due to the employment opportunity for the town of Orillia, the government decided that it would renovate the old hotel. They added more rooms, dormitories, laundry, kitchen, and dining rooms. And September 25th, 1876, the first 44 residents arrived by train, which turned into a public spectacle where hundreds of townspeople claimed to witness the event. The original name of the HRC was the Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. It was here that Orillia's institution would be separated and be independent from the Provincial Lunatics Asylum.
That name just really says so much. And the fact that we would never use words like that in a medical setting anymore, but back then it was just so casual. It was just considered terminology.
Yeah, for sure. And if you go back, like, there's also like an act. I can't remember if it's called Idiots and Imbeciles, or it's terrible. It's the wording that we used back then. This is in 1876. It just goes to prove how far we've come, but also how much more further we need to go.
We do not endorse the language in the following clip, but it is indicative of how people thought about mentally ill individuals just a generation or two ago.
Probably no greater misfortune can befall a family than the advent of a mentally defective child. Such a child presents many problems to the family and community. The family must give continuous care and protection to one whose body may gain adult size, but whose mind remains little better than that of an infant or a child. The more severely retarded require protection and care, which necessitate permanent placement in a state-supported institution. 3 grades of deficiency are recognized. Moderately retarded individuals are referred to as morons. Those who are severely retarded are classed as imbeciles, and the very severely retarded are termed idiots. Intelligence tests are used to measure ability. Mary, a normal 8-year-old with a mental age of 12 years, is taking the mannequin test. By observing the time taken to complete the test, as well as accuracy of performance, it is possible to express her achievement as mental age, and from this derive a measure of her relative mental capacity known as the intelligence quotient. Our next subject, John, has a chronological age of 20 and a mental age of 7, which classifies him as a moron. Adults so classified achieve a developmental level comparable to normal 7 to 11-year-old children. The intelligence quotient ranging from 50 to 70. Ordinarily, they cannot completely meet the regular demands of family, school, or community life. However, those in the upper mental age levels of the moron group may be self-supporting under favorable conditions, including special supervision. John completes the mannequin test, but has the feet turned wrong. Now George will attempt it. George's chronological age is 20 years, but his mental age is only 4 years. This classifies him as an imbecile. Behavioral development in this group is comparable to normal 3 to 7-year-old children. The intelligence quotient ranges from 20 to 50. Imbeciles are unable to manage their daily affairs and require constant supervision. Here we see that George lacks the ability to comprehend the test problem. Next, we have Robert ready to try the mannequin test. His chronological age is also 20 years, but his mental age is only 2 years. This classifies him with the most severely retarded idiot group. In this group, behavioral development never exceeds that of a normal 3-year-old child, and the intelligence quotient is below 20. They are incapable of performing the simplest duties for themselves.
They didn't perform lobotomies or anything on these people, did they?
As far as I've seen, I haven't come across any of the evidence that it would suggest that.
I know that happened a lot in the United States.
And it very well could have happened. It very, very well could have happened here. And it could have happened at other institutions. But a lot of it was kept hush-hush. But there's a lot of no documentation. So it very well could have happened in the early years, because this institution was open for 133 years. 2009, the HRC Center closed after 133 years of operation.
So not even our grandparents' generation. This is our generation.
Yeah, I graduated college in 2008.
Fuck.
Like, I graduated college or high school in 2003.
Yeah, I'm class of 2000 myself, so yeah.
Like, this is during our time. Like, it's hard to believe that the people that I was supporting in 2003, the institution was still open. And there were people still coming to our homes and into the community that were still at the institution. And I have multiple staff members that actually remember going to the institutions to pick up individuals to come live in our community. And these individuals that I'm talking about, like the staff members I'm talking about, are my age. I'm 37. Like, these are people that physically went there to go pick up these individuals.
Well, I have heard stories of like people who would go into these institutions undercover and like do an expose on it all.
Which there actually was, and that's how the deinstitutionalization came about. Whereas there was a gentleman who came in, he did an expose, and then the government did like this, oh no, these institutions are great places to be, and they did like this like whole propaganda bullshit. It was just ridiculous. Like, it was just really dumb. like you can't.
I mean, I've heard stories like there was this one lady I read about who actually got herself committed to one of these places by acting like she was crazy or something like that. And she somehow snuck in there with a camera and actually had physical evidence.
Yeah. So while the government is making plans to build bigger places to house individuals, the eugenics movement is happening. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because we could go on and on and on about it. But I'm just going to give everybody a basic understanding of why everyone thought institutions were a great idea. So in 1883, Sir Francis Galton and others believed that human traits were passed down from parent to child, and by eliminating those people with undesirable traits, this would cure society of all its problems.
Not even dressed out to take on the town genocide, just straight eugenic genocide.
Yeah, pretty much. Biased and unproven, eugenicists blame individuals with undesirable traits for like a shit ton of things like poverty, addiction, even venereal diseases. Eugenicists, even at one point without proof, thought they were reproducing at a higher rate than quote unquote normal society. So this is also why the HRC segregated men and women so that there was no chance of reproducing, which it didn't work. People were still reproducing.
One of Darwin's followers, Francis Galton, took up his views and applied it to how society should be. Now, Galton, he was mainly in the 19th century. He was born in 1822, and he was a scientist, a mathematician, but he's mainly remembered these days for his creation of the science of eugenics. Now, he was in favor of positive eugenics. So the basic idea of eugenics is that if you have in a society a variety of different kinds of people, some of them are going to be better for society than others. And the idea of eugenics is that you want to promote those people in society who are kind of valuable, and you want to have less of those who are not valuable. And so the idea was that this was a scientific theory, and that you could do away with old forms of prejudice, and you could base your value judgments on science. Now, there's a distinction between positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is basically trying to encourage those who are valuable for society to have as many offspring as possible, and to try and increase their portion of the population. While negative eugenics is trying to stop people who are considered bad for society from reproducing. And in fact, in extreme forms, you wouldn't just stop them from reproducing, you would kill them. Right? That's the most extreme form of negative eugenics. Galton's ideas were very influential, and eugenics soon became an international movement. It was popular both in the United States and Canada and all over Western and Northern Europe. And it was also spread to other parts of the world. You can find eugenics movements in Russia, in South America. The eugenics movement fit very well with other worries that people had around that time. And certainly in the USA and in some other countries too, there was extreme worries about immigration. There were very severe holds and demands put on immigrants, and there was a lot of worry about who was coming into the USA. And so that fit in with ideas about racial purity. Eugenics grew from its in the late 19th century and grew stronger and stronger. At least one of the main architects of it was Dr. Alfred Plötz, who was a major scientist in Germany and an international scientist. Back in 1904, there wasn't active murder, but there was a willingness to let people who were considered unfit die. So during World War I, there was great poverty in Germany around that time. One of their decisions in Germany was to let the inmates of their mental institutions die of malnutrition. So there was thought that it was better to send the food to the soldiers rather than give it to the mental patients. The basic idea coming from around 1920 was some people had unnecessary lives. The leading members of the legal profession and the psychiatric profession advocated for euthanasia. They argued that some people were incurable idiots and brain-damaged human vegetables. They thought that they'd be better off dead. And combined with this was both in the USA and in the rest of Europe, there was a massive growth in the population of mental institutions. So there was a sense of crisis that they needed to do something to reduce the numbers. The society that put the sick, the dying, and the unfit on a par with the healthy and the strong was dangerous. It wasn't just people who were at the kind of political extremes. These were the scientific leaders of the international community were very much on board with these ideas.
Trigger warning, there is going to be talk of sexual assault and rape. So they even went as far as one point to further segregate women of childbearing years and use them as unpaid kitchen labor as well as laundry staff.
Yeah, so a little slavery along with your imprisonment.
Oh, it just gets so much better because we're going to also talk about child labor as well. So while eugenics was poisoning the medical community, the Ontario government was starting the construction on the new institution on the shores of Lake Simcoe on the outskirts of the town. The government adopted the cottage plan, and I posted a picture in the chat of an aerial view of what the institution looked like. So it has one large building, and then it has all these other buildings known as cottages.
Yeah, it looks like a penitentiary. I've seen overhead shots of penitentiaries. It's becoming more and more indistinguishable, you know?
Yeah. These cottages were not cozy little places one goes to visit in the summer. These buildings were brick with basements, attics, and living spaces for all the incarcerated, and each cottage held hundreds of people. In 1887 and 1888, cottages B and L were built. These buildings housed the individuals from the old hotel. Cottages A and K were finished in 1891 and contained the admin office, an amusement hall, gym, and housed a few classrooms. The cottages also housed the ones that were deemed able to be educated. They were called high-grade mental defectives. This meant that there needed to be low-grade mental defectives, and they were sent to the older buildings to live.
Were they given different levels of freedom and ability to go outside to do activities, or were they all kind of given the same shit?
So some people were educated in the classrooms only at one point, and I'll talk about it later too, is only 100 people at one point were in classes out of 4,000 people. You were basically left to your own devices to just live out your day in these institutions. You might have been given a schedule, but you might not have been given a schedule, dependent on your cognitive ability. But for the most part, people sat around and did nothing. or they did go to school, but they weren't really learning anything. And there are some pictures of like the staff taking individuals out swimming because Lake Simcoe's not that far, but there's reports of sewage being like pumped into the lake from the institution, so people were swimming in sewage. You weren't really given any more freedoms than anybody else. It's just they put the ones that could be educated in the newer buildings because then they could be seen by the government as like, oh, look at us. We're doing good because all these people are being educated, the government not realizing that all these other people are in the dilapidated buildings.
I mean, Christ, that happens in like modern institutions. There's lots of state prisons where for inspections or for citizens' inspections or anything like that, they'll dress things up and bring their best, most functional prisoners forward, to hide the abuses and the human rights issues that may be deeper.
San Quentin does that, I know that.
Well, and funny that you say that. There are reports by the survivors that were saying that when families would come to visit, they would only allow visitors to go into one room to visit. And a lot of people were medicated and they were really strictly watched. And parents and family members were not allowed to go look at their living quarters or the other cottages. They were only sanctioned to one room and that was it. That's where they visited their family member.
Oh, and they probably had the tacit threat of like, even if you happen to tell your family member some of the things that are going on, your family member might not believe you because you're in the institution, and even if they believe you, you might get punishments afterwards for spreading dirty laundry. You're a prisoner. They can restrict your freedoms all they want.
That's exactly it. So in 1902, cottages C and M were constructed using the forced labor of the residents, and they had to work alongside prisoners from the local prison. It was important to the superintendent at that time for the institution to be self-sufficient. So staff costs money, and the government doesn't like to spend money on things that cost them. The institution had a farm, clothing manufacturing, and boot manufacturing, but not one resident saw compensation for their work, and this was in place until 1970.
It's just another form of slavery. We enslaved people from Africa because we decided that they fit into a sector of society back then that was lesser than white men. And it seems like to put people in these institutions, they created another false framework based on bigotry where these people are throwaway people, and they just made another excuse to create another network of slaves.
That's exactly it. So they made boots, so they manufactured boots and all of these other things, but it's reported that a lot of these residents didn't even have clothes for the winter. And if anybody knows the Muskoka area and Orillia, it's the snow belt in Ontario. The snow comes in and there's a lot of snow because of the lakes, right? So Ontario has a lot of lakes and all that kind of stuff. So in that section, the highways get closed down. And back then, we didn't have the same tools and stuff to get rid of the snow. They didn't have it like we have now, right?
I don't imagine that they would spend extra money to properly insulate the institution of the people they don't believe are full people,
So we're going to get into that too, about the overcrowding of the facility as well. In 1931, the name was changed to the Ontario Hospital School. It was far from a hospital and far from a school. It wasn't until 1974, when the Ministry of Community and Social Services took over, that they changed it again to its final name, to the Huronia Regional Center, or HRC. Prior to 1970, families could admit their child or children with simply a note from their member of parliament. Like that. I have reports, so I've supported individuals that were literally dropped on the steps of the institutions. And they're older individuals. Some of them are no longer on this planet, no longer on this plane. But yeah, they were literally dropped off. And you could literally get a letter from your member of parliament. Even doctors were telling parents to give up their children to the institution, send them away.
Oh, I mean, fuck. Those politicians, they aren't... even the doctors at the time, hell, doctors today sometimes don't treat mentally ill people well. Politicians aren't even doctors. They don't even have the backing of training to know better. They're just making uneducated assumptions and locking people up.
That's pretty much what was happening. Anybody just had to go in there, and you could just tell them my child is disabled or has a mental illness, and literally they would just write a letter. You bring your child with one suitcase or no suitcase, and you just drop them off on the doorstep, hand this person the letter, the nurse the letter, and see you later, child. Like, that's how easy it was to admit your child.
Dorianne is 10 years younger than me. I'm the oldest sibling, and we have a brother in the middle who's 5 years on either side. When Dorianne was born, our mother was 40, and at first Dorianne seemed to be okay, and all the milestones were missing. Slow to do everything, or things weren't happening. I'm sure my parents must have been worried, and finally the doctor gave the magic words of the day: your daughter is mentally retarded. But she was very, very autistic. Her behavior was very, very poor and rough as she aged. And my mom was a small person, not nearly as tall or as broad as me. She stayed at home till she was around the age of 7. People started, especially the doctor, my mother's hero, saying it was time for her to leave home. So off to Huronia she went. I think it was at that time 3 months before you were allowed to have a visit. And there she was in a ward, probably at least 40 kids in a ward, and they all had their little cots. That's all they really had. You couldn't send clothes for your own child. My mom was so distressed because there was nothing she could offer her that was actually hers. She was taken to Orillia, as they were, I guess, 1 or 2 at a time for outings. And Dorianne still loves nothing more than a cookie or a treat, and she always has done. She did then, too. And she sat down on the sidewalk, and she wouldn't move. And the worker didn't know what to do and got some help and got her back to the institution. And whereupon a whole investigation of her legs went on. So in her files, when I got them to make her case for abuse from Huronia, the legs seemed to be a big deal. Something must be wrong with her legs. And there were x-rays taken to Barrie to the hospital, on and on and on. But actually, that was my sister's way of avoiding abuse. Avoiding any more sexual abuse was just to simply not move her legs. And from there on, she was in a wheelchair and has remained in a wheelchair. But she did walk when she was a little girl. And then the reports would come of she's got a leg fracture, she's hurt her private area in the gym. So I could see all the letters that were sent home by physicians. To me, it all just completely pointed to abuse until finally one wonderful doctor named it, God bless him, and wrote it down. And she'd actually had an abortion there. So my poor parents, of course, luckily knew nothing of these things, very Victorian people that they were. And they didn't have to see the files. And when that all ended, my partner and I had a bonfire on our property and happily burned it up because it was just too much to have all that awful stuff around in our house. But, I realized my sister, although she does say a few words, Merry Christmas, in her, whatever voice. But I realized going through all those files, she's tried all her life to communicate. And I think it's really important for anybody who works in the disability community, especially on those rough days with people, to think people are they're trying their best to communicate. She sat down on the sidewalk and wouldn't move. Nobody paid attention. She had obviously been sexually abused and nobody paid any attention. She had broken limbs in Orillia and nobody paid any attention. And all the while, with her acting out and her, her circle that she had to have to keep herself safe, she was trying so hard to say something. So, that listening ear has to be developed in such a big way, I think, in the handicapped community, so we can actually understand what people are trying to tell us. I can say I carry my sister wherever I go, and I always will. I know that.
So it wasn't until like the 1970s when they started requiring testing of all individuals to determine the eligibility due to the threat of further overcrowding. And the Children's Aid Society was famous for dropping off difficult children and wiping their hands clean of them.
It's so revealing that the problem they had with it was overcrowding, so it's costing too much. This wasn't a human comfort and welfare problem. This was an economic problem to them.
For sure. And these institutions were famous for being underfunded by the government. Like I said before, the government doesn't like things that cost them money, right?
Yeah.
When they're not getting anything out of it. So the institution was not above child labor and used kids in all sorts of tasks around the grounds. Age 10, children worked a full day. I don't know what a full day is, but I'm assuming it's 12 to 16 hours.
Yeah, that sounds about right, unfortunately. Crazy, that's a long day for a grown man, let alone a child.
Yeah. So these children would work farm work. They did kitchen duty, collecting garbage, cleaning, taking care of younger children, including babies, sewing, making footwear, cutting lawns, shoveling snow and coal in the winter. And many children died of pneumonia at this time, which was rare for children with adequate care to die from the disease.
Yeah, because 1850 pneumonia, you might be in trouble, but we had shit figured out. If you got proper treatment by the 1970s, these kids probably didn't get proper treatment.
Nobody got proper treatment. These children especially, and we'll get into some of the things that happened to survivors or a lot of the people that died in the institution, because there was a lot of individuals. So many documents and survivor accounts paint this very clear picture of what the institution was famous for. Underfunded, understaffed, overcrowded, and the abuse individuals suffered for years. Forms of abuse that the residents suffered were not short of barbaric and medieval, like we talked about at the beginning. Straitjackets and other forms of restraints were used, even though in 1931, the Ontario Hospital Inspector recommended the hospital stop the practice. The practice of restraints was used for decades to come. So you'll see a common theme that an inspector will come in, find something, and nothing be done about it. Nobody's taken, nobody's fired, nobody's held responsible for the treatment of these individuals.
It's hard enough to feel like you can get justice in a world where you can submit a form. These people were powerless. Even the people they would complain to wouldn't listen to them.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Even their families coming in, they would be individuals that lived there would be cleaned up, and we're told, basically what we said at the beginning is if you say anything, there's punishment around the corner. A common saying that staff would say was, we'll take you out back behind the barn, and there's a cemetery back there. So you kind of put two and two together, right? You're going to take me out behind the barn, but that's where the cemetery is. It's scary, especially for a lot of these children. And the ages of these individuals range from babies up to 90 years old. So it wasn't like these were just adults or just children. It was a wide variety of the population anywhere in Ontario.
Well, it's just a wide swath of people considered uncurable. Huh?
Yeah. So small side rooms were built with no windows, sometimes being pipe rooms were used for seclusion. At one point, an inspector found 3 elderly women in a cold, damp crawl space with only their clothes on their backs and a bucket to use as a makeshift toilet.
Sometimes I really hate us as a species.
I completely agree with you, Poet. I completely agree.
Inventing flight to the moon in 60 years? Oh, go humans. Then I learn more about this shit. My confidence in humanity goes up and down so often.
In some pictures on the Remember Every Name website, you can see pictures of claw marks in these small rooms.
Holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody that's listening, go to the Remember Every Name website, because there is some really great recounts of what victims went through. It's something that's not taught in schools. So when you're reading this as an adult and you think back, you're like, what the hell, man? What the fuck? Why wasn't this taught to anybody? This is history that should be taught to people so that we don't repeat it.
This isn't something you can't sweep under the rug.
Oh, exactly, Poet. A lot of American culture is like this too, but it's a lot of Canadian culture where people don't want to put forward funding on education about residential schools or like our colonization of Canada. I talked about the Greenwood district that was burnt down by a bunch of racists in the early 1900s, and there are lots of people in that city that don't know that that occurred.
And the things we do to each other is so disheartening. It's so wrong.
Well, it's like a thing I read a while back. It said, life is like a novel. Part is written by fate, part is by circumstances, but what we ultimately live by is what we write ourselves.
Yeah, many thousands of little choices make history.
Yeah, for sure. In 1971, the MP from the NDP, which is the New Democratic Party, was on tour of HRC when it was noticed that not just the younger children were kept in caged crib cots. So if you look off, what I've showed everybody is a child next to another group of children. It looks like a crib, but then on the top metal bars, there's just more bars so that a child can't get out.
It's like a hamster cage for a child.
Yeah, and there's not even an exercise wheel in there.
I have to laugh at this part, not because of the children, but because of what the government did. So when the press found out, the superintendent claimed that the cots were being used because there was a staff shortage. A few days later, the government said, no, it's because it's for their safety, and claimed that the cots were perfectly safe. 4 months later, 31-year-old Yvonne Shear strangled to death in the bars of the caged crib cot. Even though it was a case of clear neglect, Yvonne Shear's death was ruled an accident.
That's so fucked up.
This kind of reminds me of something I saw a while back. I don't know if it was up there as well, but like back in the 30s and 40s here in America, they had this product where it would basically be a kid's crib, like what you see in that picture there, but like on the outside of a window. Supposedly it was supposed to give the kid like more air, more fresh air and stuff, but it basically just subjected them to all the elements and things like that.
I think I remember seeing pictures of that. So the extreme use of medication was used just as much as restraints and seclusion. It was reported that sedatives and tranquilizers were administered in inappropriate ways. One was reported to have been given tranquilizers for screaming and crying, and when he was seen wandering about, he was given a sedative, even though the standard was that it was to be a last resort when the resident was at risk of hurting themselves or others. So this report states like this person was screaming and crying when it should have been used as a last resort. Like they shouldn't have even been tranquilized, shouldn't have even been given a sedative.
Like, what is that even? Is it just that it's easier for them to abuse their powers over people than to actually treat, just they didn't want to actually do their jobs?
And because of the shortage of staff too, as we'll see, like there's reports of like only 2 nurses being available for like 17 people or like 100 people. And it was easier for staff to medicate these individuals because they were disturbing other individuals. And then that would create like a domino effect of everybody being upset.
This kind of reminds me of like Dr. Harold Shipman, if you've ever heard of him.
I don't think I have.
He was a doctor that was a serial killer, right? He gave lethal doses of something or other? Yeah.
Yeah, he basically did that because he enjoyed holding the power of life and death in his hands.
I guess my question is sort of like, were they doing it, I suppose, out of convenience or because they enjoyed having this power over people, which I don't know if that's a question any of us can necessarily answer, although obviously the actions are immoral and cruel, like whether they did it because they felt that they had to, like how people used to think it was necessary to hit your children.
Honestly, I think Rocky, I think it's both because it made it easier. And I think some people have a God complex where they are able to hold that power over other individuals.
Yeah, I mean, what's the phrase? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I'm here with Leon to get some commentary on chemical restraints. Now, most of the stuff that I found criticizes overuse of chemical restraints on the elderly, but overuse of chemical restraints can happen to any age group, correct?
When we're looking at chemical restraints, we have to understand primarily what they are. And so a chemical restraint is any medication that's used not as a form of treatment for a mental illness or for any sort of illness, really, but is a medication which is usually an antipsychotic or a sedative hypnotic or an anxiolytic that is used specifically to restrict someone's movement or to restrict certain behaviors. And the reason chemical restraints are so dangerous in the elderly is that they cause folks to have a lot more falls than they otherwise would, particularly when using sedative hypnotics, because they do cause dizziness, they cause sedation, they'll affect your cognitive abilities so that you don't have the same ability to ask for help when you need it. For example, if you need to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. When chemical restraints are used on mental patients, like we know from research that they do have negative outcomes as far as worsening people's mental conditions because you have that feeling of being trapped, of being unable to move.
There's a proper context in which chemical restraints could be used, but I understand that they're to be used as a last resort, and from the sounds of it, a lot of applications of chemical restraints are not used ethically or when they're supposed to be used. Am I right about that?
I think it's acceptable to use chemical restraints in certain emergency psychiatric settings, like in a mental health ER where someone is acutely psychotic and they're a danger to themselves or others. Then it makes sense to apply a chemical restraint. However, in more long-term or tertiary treatment settings, chemical restraints are completely inappropriate. We've got a new protocol that's being adopted in North America called GPA, or Gentle Persuasive Approaches. And it was first tested in elderly dementia populations. And fortunately, the home that I work in is a GPA home. It's a 2-day training course that we take that care aides and nurses will go to. It teaches us techniques, just like the name suggests, gentle persuasive, that allows us to handle behaviors in particularly dementia patients, but there's also application for psychiatric patients as well. It turns out that if you're good at your job and you're really patient and you act like a detective in determining exactly what makes certain people tick, you can handle their behaviors without having to use any physical or chemical restraints. It's now seen in the medical community that chemical restraints are sort of a lazy solution. As I had said before, they're appropriate in emergency situations, but if you're using them every day, you're doing something wrong. Now, that's my professional opinion. I'll now roll out my personal opinion. As someone who has been a psychiatric patient and has been under the control of chemical restraints, I can tell you there's nothing more terrifying than having a nurse walk up to you with a syringe, flanked on both sides by security guards, and have that nurse stab the needle into your ass and then find out that you're unable to move any of your limbs. That's a fucked up sort of experience. And that's what happens with chemical restraints. We're using things like Halidol and other antipsychotics and anxiolytics and sedative hypnotics to stop you from being able to move. And the feeling is terrifying because your mind is still there. You know that you're being restrained, but there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And that panic and fear leads to worse mental health outcomes. So things end up worse in the end than if the medical professionals had just tried a little bit harder to figure out exactly what you need. Because we know that negative behaviors and people trying to jump out of bed is as a result of unfulfilled needs. And so if you can figure out what those needs are, whether it's they got to take a shit or they're scared, figure that out and you can generally handle the behaviors without any medication.
So I think it's pretty easy to agree that the misuse of chemical restraints is unethical. But since you're a medical ethicist, could you explain what it violates exactly? Because I understand that it's not for their well-being and it violates their consent, but could you expand on that?
The hallmark of medical ethics is the belief in the autonomy of the person. So that autonomy of the person is one's own right to control what happens to one's body. Now, that can extend from everything from abortion rights to chemical restraints to any other treatments that are applied to you. The hallmark of that is that you get to decide what happens to your body and to your brain, and no one else gets to make that decision for you. Now, of course, if you are in a situation where you're psychotic, there are substitute decision makers that will come in and make those decisions for you because you don't have the ability to protect yourself. But in cases where chemical restraints are used on a daily basis, that's a violation of the autonomy of the person.
Well, thank you, Leon, for your insight and expertise.
Thank you, Ood.
Now, back to the show.
So as late as the early 2000s, psychotropic medication was sometimes administered as staff felt it was needed, another act that was explicitly forbidden by the government standards. A psychotropic medication is any drug that affects behavior, mood, thoughts, or perception. It's an umbrella term for a lot of different drugs, such as anti-anxiety medication and antidepressants. In Ontario now, we have very strict guidelines. There are many steps to these psychotropic medications, or what we call chemical restraint. There has to be a behavioral support plan. There's a doctor review. There's protocols put in place, pharmacy review, ethical review monthly. Like, these medications are reviewed monthly. If a person goes a whole year without taking the medication, then it's discontinued. You can see like where we started and then where we are now. 100% could be better, but we have very, very strict guidelines around medication.
Yeah, you can't just chemically restrain somebody because you don't feel like dealing with them for the next 8 hours.
Yeah. So the protocol has like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then depending on what the doctor has prescribed, and then the medication. So once you've tried everything, then an individual would get the medication. The most used tranquilizers were Largatil and Halidol, which if taken inappropriately is known to cause epilepsy. And because of poor documentation and note-taking, it is nearly impossible to know how people's lives were cut short as a result. So we don't know when people were over-medicated, when they had a seizure, they don't know if somebody died from the tranquilizer or because they had epilepsy. They don't know. By the 1930s, many of the buildings came under a state of disrepair, along with staff shortages, led to less than desirable living conditions. At one point, there was only one attendant assigned to one cottage that held 32 residences. 6 of those suffering from scabies were locked in a room so as not to spread, and they had absolutely no supervision. Overcrowding was a major issue, leading to one cottage having 17 boys sleeping on the floor. Most of these buildings had little to no insulation, therefore making them cold and damp in the winter. And HRC was only listed as a 1,400-bed hospital school, but at one point its highest number is reported to be 3,000, with only 100 attending school classes.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up.
And those 100 that they get to take classes are the ones they parade in front of inspectors and politicians and media and stuff, eh?
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
Now repeat back to the nice people what we taught you to say, and you'll get dinner.
Yeah.
Yep.
A 1937 inspection found Cottage A to be 16 people over capacity, with some residents sleeping 2 to a bed.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm assuming these beds were for only one person.
Yeah, they were like single beds. There's no double, no 3/4, no queen. Like, these were single beds. Only 2 nurses were available to care for these patients, and the cottage smelled strongly of feces. Soiled laundry was found piled at the foot of the stairs and in a storeroom. In another cottage, a pillowcase was discovered covered in blood and pus, and another was found to be covered in dried feces. Wooden floors absorbed urine and other bodily fluids, which led to excessive scrubbing and rot.
They don't have regular laundry services. They probably don't have regular garbage services. Like, they don't pay enough to have those regular hygiene standards. So, like, I imagine these patients were left to their own devices, and they did the best they could. They couldn't leave. They couldn't fetch cleaning supplies, and they were forced to do the best they can, just like having to soil themselves where they stood.
And a lot of these things were being done by children too. Remember, like we were talking about, that age 10, all these children are doing garbage and all that stuff. They were probably only doing it for the buildings that inspectors would go to or visitors would go to. They were cutting the lawn to make sure that the institution looked nice on the outside, but in reality, on the inside, it wasn't that nice. There was an inspector that came in 1940 who saw a resident, and she had large ulcers on her knee, and she basically told him, it's from me being on the floor scrubbing the floors. And as a result, the inspector had suggested, you guys need to start putting terrazzo flooring in, which was like non-absorbent and it was easy to clean. but they still didn't do it. They still had hardwood floors. So there was no privacy in the bathrooms and remained so from the 1930s all the way to the 1970s. Almost 80% of the residents during the 70s contracted hepatitis B, and 5% of those individuals resulted in long-term health issues. This also led to Orillia being 35.3% higher than the rest of Ontario for hepatitis B infection. The spread was because everybody was using the same toothbrush or everybody was using the same cloth when they were bathing. There was a report of one counselor in 1991 saying that they were only given 2 washcloths for 6 residents. And all the toothbrushes, so everybody was given a toothbrush, but they were all thrown in the same bag, despite the fact that one resident was a hepatitis carrier.
And like we've all learned a lot in the past couple of years about what it takes to stop the spread of disease. And when you're overcrowded, you can't socially distance. When you don't have the right materials, you can't prevent your bodily fluids from being spread, even in your breath and stuff like that. These people were set up for failure, and like of course they were the victim of like disease after disease.
And I have some individuals that are still suffering from the effects of those poor practices. Sanitation, there was pest infestation, so mice, cockroaches, even so bad as an infestation of mosquitoes in the dead of winter.
Jesus Christ.
I didn't even know that that could happen, but when I read that, I was like, I guess that, yeah, that makes sense. Like, especially if you have standing water, right?
That's the only good part about winter is the fucking mosquitoes are dead. You can't even have that?
Exactly. And I'm from Northern Ontario, so like when the mosquitoes are gone, it's so good. Like we love when the mosquitoes are gone.
Oh yeah, you guys got some heavy bush up there.
Yeah.
Say here in Colorado, we normally don't get mosquitoes. We get friggin' horse flies.
Oh, I hate a horsefly.
They'll just take a chunk, those greedy bastards.
Well, like where I came from in Alabama, the mosquitoes were so big, every time one bit you, you had to have an immediate blood transfusion to stay alive.
I'm just imagining like infestation of mosquitoes in the wintertime and just like, oh man, that sounds terrible.
You would think it would be like Armageddon or something.
Oh, for sure. One survivor, Leo Gotti, remembers being awakened before dawn and sent outside to shovel snow on the path and steps that led from the administration building to the railway tracks. Despite not being given proper clothing to protect him from the elements, Gotti was not allowed back into the facility until he had finished his work. In the summer months, Leo would cut the grass of the institution's massive lawns with a push mower, often working until he developed heat stroke.
A push mower?
Yeah, a push mower. And if you go back and you see, like, when I posted the aerial view, if you look at all that grass...
You're talking about one of those mowers that doesn't have like a motor or anything. It's got the little spinny blades thing inside of it.
Yeah.
There's acres of area. Acres.
Might as well tell the kid to go use a scythe.
What the fuck?
Yeah, exactly. Because you know that they weren't springing for gasoline, gas-powered lawnmowers.
Oh, hell no.
The food was terrible. Many individuals were not given plates, cutlery, and were often fed cold food, even though warming plates were available to the staff. And from 1950 to 1965, the standard meal in some units became 8 ounces of complete food mix. And does anybody know what complete food mix equals to?
I would assume like baby food.
Gruel. It's basically what gruel is.
Oh,
yeah.
Yep. I know what that's like. I had that in the military.
And a glass of milk. That's what you were given at mealtime, 8 ounces. Didn't matter how big you were, how small you were given 8 ounces of gruel.
This is like Oliver Twist shit.
Yeah.
One staff member recalls worms in soup bones. Remember every name member Cindy Scott remembers finding a shard of glass in a hot dog when she was a resident of the institution in the 1970s. And another survivor remembers ants in his porridge.
Oh, and you can't tell me that inspectors were like very motivated to make sure, have you kept your meats between this temperature and this temperature?
There was no food handling courses being handed out to the staff, that's for sure.
You know, it's like, how long has this been under the heat lamps or anything like that?
Actually, there's another part that I didn't put in here, but like the government basically had to fight with the staff at one point to make sure that they were washing their hands before they prepped food. To just imagine, like, that's standard. Like when I walk into work, I disinfect my hands and then I go to the sink and I wash my hands. Like that is standard.
What is it that you do?
I work with people on various degrees of disabilities and mental illness. I'm what they call a direct support professional. So like I help them with their acts of daily living. I'm actually a caseworker as well. So I also case manage a lot of these individuals' lives as well. So I make sure that money's accounted for. I make sure that they're getting out. I make sure that they're happy, and I inspect their living facilities. I have meetings with their providers and all that kind of stuff.
Well, props to you for doing good work.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have a question. Did you find out about this before or after you came into this line of work?
After I came into this line of work. So I've been in this line of work for 20 years, since I was 17 years old. So that's fresh out of high school. I literally went from high school to working in this field. And it wasn't until I met an individual from Gravenhurst Institution that I found out about the institutions in Ontario. And actually, there are institutions all over Canada, but the one that's well documented is the HRC. And there are thousands and thousands of survivors still alive today.
Okay, I am a survivor. I lived in Huronia and Gravenhurst, which are the both institutions, together from the age of 13 years old, got out, and because they had let me out because they made me pregnant in there. The staff had sent me into a room where you have to do that or punished with a dope needle. So I got pregnant there. The baby was born. It was a girl, but they took the baby and killed it. All they could say to me, it was a girl. Mrs. Green is a popular nurse that worked in there called the RNA. She tortured me very severely, broke my legs, damaged my eyes, and gave me a favorite name, Bug Eyes. I always wondered why Bug Eyes was in. I looked in the mirrors and said, "What's wrong with my eyes?" She calls me Bug Eyes.
They used to fly swatter on us mostly in the rat brush.
And I remember if you stole cookies, for example, I was made to get up at 5:30 in the morning and scrub the floor with a toothbrush. And one of the staff says, "I'm surprised at you, Marie." You know? Like they would punish you for petty, stupid little things.
Yeah.
You know, and I was too afraid of them. Like, I think we got picked on every single day.
I grew up, I turned 12 years old at the time. Staff is supposed to keep us in line, right? Supposed to care for us? No, they didn't. Every staff used a strap on us. Used belts, hands, kick, pinch, whatever. Pull your hair if you have to. Staff didn't like me anyways. I talked about this all the time. Institution is not a place to be. I have a learning disability. I always say, learning disability don't stop me, and you know that. My story, anything you take back, realize what our stories are, learn them. And maybe it's a surprise that you can understand what we went through. Thank you.
So conditions at the Huronia Regional Center led to widespread abuse of residents, and for much of the 20th century, there was no way for residents to report abuse to the outside world. So like Oud said at the beginning, people didn't care. There was no way for people to report their abuse, and there was no chain of command. There was no reporting center or anything like that. So now in Ontario, we have quality assurance measures. We have a way of reporting abuse, whether that's the person that's being supported, staff, or management. And this is where we're going to get into sexual assaults and sexual abuse. So just skip ahead a little bit if you don't want to hear about this. According to survivors, sexual abuse at the institution was rampant and came from both staff and their fellow residents. Many punishments that residents recall were in fact forms of sexual abuse. These punishments included residents being forced to line up naked and play with their genitals in front of staff and other residents. being forced to lay naked on the floor with their face in another resident's buttocks, and male residents having string tied around their genitals as punishment for wetting the bed. Many of these abusive forms of punishment were corroborated by the accounts of multiple survivors.
Getting enjoyment out of dehumanizing people, basically.
Yeah. Routine practices carried out by the HRC, they likely hid evidence of sexual abuse. Many female residents received injections of the contraceptive Depo-Provera, which is a birth control, which had not been approved for general use. Others were prescribed birth control so that it would stop their period. In addition to prescribing the birth control, there is evidence that female residents were sterilized. Many of it was carried out in the facility, in all facilities across Ontario. It wasn't just HRC, but it was many, many different institutions.
Which is like eugenics, stopping the people you don't want to reproduce from reproducing.
Exactly. Evidence suggested that venereal disease was a major problem at the Huronia Regional Center, but staff were instructed to hide this information from the parents of the residents who became infected with the sexually transmitted disease, and they were told to hide the fact that they were put on antibiotics or any of that kind of stuff.
That's something that I see failing again and again in different institutions. Summer youth camps, old folks' homes, institutions, penitentiaries. You're going to rely on people's willpower not to fuck? People are going to fuck. Give them the tools to fuck safely.
Well, for sure. And even those that don't want to are still going to be sexually assaulted. And pregnancies happen from that.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And there are reports, Ood, I don't know if you want, I'll send you the link later, but for Cindy Scott, she talks about babies being born in the institution and then being murdered, being murdered after they're born.
They're probably thinking one less mouth to feed.
One less undesirable, what they consider undesirable human that may procreate. It was a big part of this was eugenics.
My name is Cindy Scott. I live in the Orillia Huronia Regional Centers. Children, adults, children, and they're all being abused, men and women. As you could see, the round, this horrible building. At the Huronia Regional Center, this has been closed since 2009. Thank God for that. As you can see, the straps right here, they hit children. The back, their legs, their feet, their hands. It's not a horrible situation, and it is not a very nice. Now, then all the staff, they're really treating these people horrible things. They can't even talk. They can't even say no, pinch, grab, smack. It is a horrible situation, and the government should be ashamed of themselves. I think the staff did a pretty horrible thing to get away with it. They sexual assault to the girls. They have sex. And if the staff been abused, one of the kids, smacked. It's a horrible situation. You have no idea what it's like to be in the hospital. We don't know what causing the death, but we sure know that the staff can get away with murder, and they can. Sexual assault, abuse, murder, and they've been killed here at the Huronia Regional Center. What they do is they sexual assault, they got pregnant, they take the child out, and they just burned it or killed them. And that's what they do. It is scary until these people tell them, don't you tell, or I will kill you. And that's what the staff told every one of them, of these children, not to tell. Let's just hope everybody will understand. Remember every name. Please click on the Facebook remember every name. Just go on and they'll tell you a whole area, they'll tell you the whole line. I'm Cindy Scott. I've survived. I'm here today.
Many people, there was a woman named Cheryl. Her name wasn't Cheryl, but that's what the newspaper called her. She had a traumatic brain injury, and when she returned back to her mother's place, she had regressed during her time at the institution. She could no longer count to 25 or recite the alphabet, and when she was asked about the scars on her back, she clammed right up. I have an individual who I supported. She was dropped off on the doorsteps of the institution at 5 years old and came out 50 years later, still with the capacity of a 5-year-old.
I mean, it reminds me of that experiment where they take 2 baby monkeys and they give one a soft mother, like a mother puppet that's soft and it can cuddle and it can show affection, and they simulate the mother like caring for the little baby monkey, and that monkey grows up to be functional and able to communicate. And then they give another baby monkey a hard metal mother monkey, and the monkey gets no affection. The love it receives is cold and mechanical, and that monkey has trouble communicating with other monkeys as it grows up. Like, I imagine same thing would happen to humans. You lock them away, you neglect them, you bore them out of their minds, which is traumatic, does cause trauma, like if you don't give them enough stimulation, and it's no wonder these people regress or stay the same.
Yeah, for sure.
About those monkeys you were saying about, wasn't there some similar to that where this dude did like an experiment where he would put the baby monkeys inside like a hollow metal wedge with a mesh over the top so they couldn't get out?
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. We've done some shit to monkeys. Good God.
You know, and then what you were saying a minute ago about humans can have trauma from boredom. I mean, I've seen people actually lose their minds from being in like either a completely silent room, so quiet you could even hear your own blood running through your veins, or like a completely dark room or a completely white room, and they can go nuts.
There's a reason that solitary confinement can cause literal brain damage.
Like she said earlier, we're social creatures.
Yeah.
For sure. And there's so much other tortures and treatments, quote unquote, that they use. It's beyond my capacity to realize how badly these individuals suffered. And not a lot of people know about them. And it's really, really sad to see the stories that come out, especially by the survivors. I missed this part, but like cold tubbing was used for minor offenses such as stealing, where a person was placed in a cold tub of water and basically a metal frame. So think of the caged cot aspect was put over top of them so that they couldn't get out.
Like inducing hypothermia, basically.
Pretty much. And individuals were told, this is the nicest torture that we could do for you because you only stole something.
I've heard stories of back in the day when mental institutions were still coming around, like they would strap a dude into a chair of some kind and spin him around like a friggin' dryer, and supposedly that was going to cure his lunacy.
Oh. So those staff members that did report abuse were met with hostility, and most either quit or were transferred to another part of the institution. Many long-term employees stated that they never witnessed abuse, but placement students from Georgia College and Cambrian College, which is the college that I currently attend, reported many incidents of abuse while they were employed. Most documentation was falsified to protect staff members who committed acts of abuse. Everyone was in on it. Didn't matter who you were, upper management, it didn't matter.
Yeah, and who's going to call them out? Who's the cop on the beat that's going to be like, hey, you're destroying evidence? Yeah. Nobody.
Lack of supervision was another large reason why the deaths were so high. 19-year-old Robert Robertson drowned after having a seizure while swimming. In 1944, Thomas Bowers, at 33 years old, died when he was struck by a car while walking the institution grounds. The Canadian National Railway line operated through the HRC grounds. We call it CN now. And many residents were struck and killed every year because of the trains. There were reports of homicide, but police would rule it normally an accident or unknown. There was a woman named Hilda Sturman was found dead in a boathouse near the institution's beach. Sturman had been a resident of the facility since the age of 14. She was found tied to a chair, badly beaten, and her cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. The murderer turned out to be 20-year-old Douglas Tompkins, another resident who had recently been released from the institution, and due to improper supervision, resident abuse was commonplace at HRC. Given the severity of the crime, it seems possible that Tompkins may have seriously harmed or even killed other residents during his incarceration at the facility. I mean, how would you know that somebody was murdered? There was no documentation. People were covering up. The police were covering up, the staff, the management. Albert Morris, an 18-year-old Indigenous resident that died of blunt force trauma from a staff kicking him so hard that it ruptured his liver.
Jesus.
At the time, staff claimed he had fallen down the stairs. It wasn't until much later that other residents and staff came forward to claim that it was Harold Rogers, who was a staff member, that had killed Albert. Roger was convicted of manslaughter in 1992 for the wrongful death of Albert. 30 years after his death, Harold never saw a jail cell.
How can you be convicted and not serve a day in jail?
He actually died before he was convicted.
Oh.
I mean, look at Trump. He's not in jail.
Yeah. I honestly, to read the story is nuts. I did share a picture in the group chat of the individual Albert who died. He was the Indigenous individual who was killed by Harold. And it's the picture's very grainy, but you kind of get. He was just an 18-year-old boy.
Yeah, just a kid.
Just a kid. Deaths were shrouded in secrecy. Betty Lou Abbott died one night, and her roommate survivor, Patricia Seth, who we'll talk about in a minute, reported that she never knew what happened to Betty, and one minute she was there, and the next she was gone. And I actually had an individual say this to me one day, like literally word for word what Patricia said. She said to me, and I'll never forget these words, I had to walk over my friend, and one minute she was there, and one minute she was gone. And I will never forget those words from that individual to this day.
Disappeared in the night, right?
Yeah. Oh, disappear. Yeah, that's literally what would happen is like people would come and go, and they would literally just disappear in the middle of the night. Nobody knows where they went.
So this is Huronia Regional Center. All the people here, they live here, they died. And when I see them, that it was really horrible, the staff, the way that they treated them, they smacked them across their head. There was a lot of yelling and screaming and carry on. The stuff that they don't like, you just have no idea how horrible that is. This is the one where I am when I was abused, sexually abused. Men and women, they all sleep there. That was the bathroom. This is the bedroom. And we're all naked. And I was in the tub. It was really hurt, and it really sick I was. Because there's 7 staff. They're all looking at me at the bathtub. It was a horrible situation. They have chains on their door, the real chain doors, that they're all locked, and they have bars. They're inside the building. We could have no way to go out. At the playground, I was here playing all these playgrounds. In the bush, there's a couple of staff, they're in there, but these people, they're sexual assault. They're in the bushes right inside of it. This one guy came out and I knew what he was doing. And I thought I know how I know the girls can't sit down. They hurt them. That's where I was, over the other side of the cottage. The small area, what I was in there. I was in that little room that was inside all the rest of the other children. And they're rocking back and forth, playing with fingers, and I was just sitting in the corner, just being a very sad girl. I wasn't very happy. Well, here we are. We're at the cemetery. Everywhere there's children, men and women, and babies. People don't care about babies, but they brought it here. They didn't know what to do. So they brought it here. They call it the handicapped babies that they don't want. Like I said, hope. Let's just get the government get this straight. Get the fact. All the cemetery has to be shortened out, straighten them up a little bit. The names have to be proper. The death has to be names, and the death has to be proper names. All the stones don't need numbers, they need names. So, please, listen to all the survivors, what happened to them. They survived. I survived. Here I am today. I'm 53 years old. I'm Cynthia Scott, Huronia Regional Center, 1971.
So March 31st, 2009, the HRC Center finally closed after 133 years of operation. In the weeks leading up to the institution's closure, Orillia's local paper, the Packet and Times, ran a series of glowing articles about the good old days of the facility's operation. Yeah. And in 2009, that's like the beginning of Facebook and stuff like that. And from reports, some of the old staff were like in Facebook groups about like how great the Huronia Center was. And yeah, it was pretty messed up.
Yeah, remember that time that we murdered that innocent internee? What's the term?
Incarcerated. Yeah.
Yeah, remember when we murdered that inconvenient incarcerated person in cold blood? Ha ha ha, good old days?
Oh yeah, that one.
Like, I don't know how these people can... I don't understand.
I know, it just boggles my mind even to this day. In April of the same year, survivor Maria Slark and Patricia Seth, we talked about earlier, launched a class action lawsuit against the government of Ontario for abuse and mistreatment they suffered. The lawsuit was settled out of court, and the government agreed to pay $35 million to the survivors still alive. Many of those that did not speak and may have suffered the most received almost nothing because they could not describe the horrible times and abuse spent at HRC. I have a story about an individual who I supported. He died in 2019. I'd been supporting this individual probably for like 6-7 years. And somebody from the lawyer's office came and did an interview with him and his caseworker. And this individual can't speak, what we call in the industry as nonverbal. So doesn't speak words. And they were asking all sorts of like terrible questions. Like, did anybody ever spray you down in cold water? Did anybody ever touch your genitals? Did anybody ever lay in bed with you? Did anybody ever make fun of you for whatever? And it was just absolutely insane, the amount of questions that were asked. But this individual can't describe what happened to them. Like, this person was actually at Huronia and suffered all sorts of abuses that we'll never know. And these stories are being lost because individuals are getting older and because their stories aren't being told. They did get a settlement from it, but it wasn't as big of a settlement as it should have been.
To me, it was a place of fear.
Soon, 3 class action lawsuits were filed, each seeking $2 billion. Marie and Pat became the lead plaintiffs in the Huronia class action.
Well, we were quite excited. We thought we were going to go to court and tell our story against these people that abused us.
Well, I hoped we would get a lot of money for the abuse they gave us, to give us enough to even to buy a house.
Marie and Pat thought a class action lawsuit seeking $2 billion would not only provide compensation, but a sense of justice for other survivors. The law firm, Koski Minsky LLP, agreed to take on the case. Online, the firm describes itself as advocates and tireless defenders, with a motto that justice matters. It's also one of Canada's leading law firms for class actions, especially when it comes to institutional abuse in Ontario.
Our early meetings with Koski Minsky seemed quite respectful, and I think really all the way to certification, we felt they were listening to us.
Years after certification, Marie and Pat went through grueling trial prep. A week before they would take the stand in 2013, a Koski Minsky lawyer told the Toronto Star, "We're going ahead no matter what." Then all of a sudden, a settlement was reached.
Were you surprised when you heard the word settlement?
Well, I'm not surprised, stunned. Nobody told us.
But the settlement was only one surprise. Marilyn and Jim were devastated to hear the proposed $2 billion class action was reduced to just $35 million, and almost half wouldn't even go directly to survivors.
It's completely deceiving to talk about the $35 million because so much of it went to the lawyers, the class proceedings fund, expenditures, and so on, and couldn't be claimed by class members. Pretty close to half went elsewhere, let's put it that way.
Massive disparity. It's very hard to compare any one person's settlement to a court award because, there are different factors at play. But overall, when you look at the big picture, and we're in the tens of thousands in one category, and we're in $100,000 plus in the other category, I mean, that's a very big discrepancy.
Are lawyers making too much money off the backs of vulnerable people?
It seems to me that in cases where the lawyers are paid more than is paid out to the victims, that's unreasonable. That should never be the case.
In the 3 class actions for Huronia, Southwestern, and Rideau, the total settlement was $67.7 million. Koski-Minsky made $14 million in legal fees. Survivors got just over $37.5 million in total, with the average payout to each survivor around $11,000. An apology was also part of the settlement, delivered by Ontario's then Premier Kathleen Wynne.
Mr. Speaker, a government's responsibility is to care for its people, and therein lies a basic trust between the state and the people. I want to address a matter of trust before this House and my assembled colleagues. I offer an apology to the men, women, and children of Ontario who were failed by a model of institutional care for people with developmental disabilities. We must look in the eyes of those who've been affected and to those they leave behind and say, we are sorry.
I have another individual who couldn't speak, but because she was a biter, quote unquote, they pulled all her teeth out.
Jesus Christ.
I supported this individual for 5 years, and her aunt literally told me this, and I was like, oh my fucking God, like, are you serious?
Did you have to hold yourself in place?
Like just short of levitating off, like I can't even, and I was a teenager, like I was really young when I found out all of this information about the individuals I've been supporting, and I have multitude of individuals that have been in institutions that their stories are literally being forgotten. And it's really sad.
It's a tragedy that those who are victimized and institutionally abused, that the trauma from that abuse often keeps them from telling their story, which adds to the perception that it's not going on as often as we think.
Or that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm going to highly suggest listeners, people, whoever's listening to this, go to the Remember Every Name and search Rhea Slark, Patricia Seth, and Cindy Scott. They tell their stories, and there is absolutely no way in hell I can even give justice to those stories. These are women that are still alive today. And it's crazy to think that these women are still alive and still suffering the effects of what happened to them in the institution. So remember, Cindy Scott was the woman that found the shard of glass in her hot dog. Patricia Seth was the one that her roommate was there and all of a sudden was not there. Maria Slark and Patricia Seth were the ones that led the class action lawsuit. So every year, the survivors on Mother's Day do a remembrance walk to HRC and to the graveyard. Every resident that was in the institution was given a number upon arrival at the facility. And if you died on the grounds, you would only receive a numbered plaque. So this is basically mass graves of just people that had numbers. They were numbered. You were only given a numbered plaque. And this was to protect the identity of the family. So like these plaques were registered to a person, but a lot of this information was lost. Some of these information from 1883, I want to say to 1953, all that information is missing, like of who some of these plaques belong to. Today in 2022, there are still numerous sites with numbers and no records on who the person is. It is also believed that there are about 1,000 unmarked graves on the sites, as stated by one survivor, Harold Dougal. He recounts in his survivor video of how staff would push bodies into holes in the ground like they were garbage.
Basically mass graves.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll show you the map of the grounds. Like this is a huge cemetery. Like this is massive.
Good Lord.
Holy fuck.
Yeah. And this is you can visit this today. I'm actually planning on going this Mother's Day to do the walk of remembrance. It's only 3 hours from where I live, so I think it'll be a good kind of ending to my research and kind of to this.
Definitely worth the trip.
Yeah. Today, many survivors want to see the building destroyed. There's a video compilation of Maria, Patricia, Cindy, and Harold Dougal. They're asked the question what they want to see with the grounds and what they want to see happens to the building. And they want it torn down. But the government wants to turn it into a long-term care facility, which is another form of institutionalization. And a lot of individuals, that's a whole nother podcast, it's a whole nother episode, is basically a lot of individuals with disabilities end up in long-term care. So they're going from institution to community back into institutionalization. And it's really sad. The survivors want to see how the graveyard is kept memorialized, but to this day, the government refuses to hear them and has since installed a pipeline, possibly disturbing the graves of their friends. And survivors still fight for equality and to be heard in the society and to be treated as an equal.
Hi, my name is Cindy Scott. I live at Huronia Research Center. 1971, since I was 7 years old, that institution. In our part of our cemetery, it's the institution. That's the part of our cemetery. I go there every time when I go there, when I see it. And it's very sad because the staff, the way they treat them, that they murder them and they kill them. And we just don't know where all the bodies are. We have no idea where they are, so that kind of bothers me a little bit.
My name is Harold Dougal. I was in HRC 11 years old in 1960. People don't understand the damage that everybody did to us. In 2009, March the 31st, some God they're closed. All the institutions in Ontario are closed. The government is walking all over us for the moment. We can't do anything. I went out with Mitch, Cindy out to the graveyard. They have things across the sidewalk, names on them. How the government don't know how many people in there. We don't know. We know there's people there.
My name is Antoinette Marie Chalabois. When I was a little girl, they took me, I was with foster people, and they took me up to this Orillia. I didn't know what it was or nothing. And there was one supervisor there said, "Oh, you've been here before." I said in my head, "Never I've been here, because I don't know this." And they told me I didn't deserve to be there, and I got out. I think it was 1964. But I wish they never open another institution again. I am very happy that we closed all the institution, and I'm very happy to be with the class action, that I could help out and tell them what's going on.
Well, my name's Marie Slark, and I was in Orillia from 1961, and then I didn't get discharged till 1974, and I'm a representative of the class action against the government. Yeah, so I'm glad it closed down for good. I hope they burn the place down.
My name's Betty Bond. I'm a survivor of the HRC. I went in when I was around between 2 and 3 years of age and got out when I was about 9 and a half. Just a lot of things has not been treated with respect, or I think even our sayings, and we have no say in the memorial thing of the grounds of the cemetery. They've just gone ahead and did what they thought was right, and they're not listening to us, because I just feel, as I said, is still a label, and what do we know? But we're the ones that live this life and live behind those closed walls, doors, whatever it may be, cellars and stuff, and we live the life, so we know what we're talking about.
My name is Beverly Link. I was there in 1953 when I was 11 years old. I'm glad it's closed. There's a lot I seen in there which I didn't like to see.
My name is Carrie Ann Ford Tompkins. I entered Orillia Institution at the age of 13, 1963. I'm happy it's closed in a way, but hurt because it's still there when we drive by, and sadly I have to close my eyes because due to the place of my nightmares and how people suffered and died in there, and I was a number. So I think it should be torn down. Nasty. The poor souls don't even have the right names on it. Get the darn government to fix it up and make the souls happy. Everybody's titled to a burial and a name and the day they died.
It's just, it's sad to see that people, even to this day, and it's a constant fight, even for myself as a caseworker, to fight for people's rights. People just want to be heard. That's it. They want the same that everybody else gets in this world. And it's not a hard thing to do.
It's hard to come away from an episode like this having hope, because we got to keep fighting to make things better. Don't fall into that doomerism despair where you give up making things better. Like, those abusive institutions that She-Wolf talked about today, they aren't much better, but they're better than the Spartan tradition of tossing anybody who is different off of a cliff. And the institutions we have today, imperfect as they may be, full of flaws as they may be, are an improvement on those early institutions. And the talk about mental health, even in the last 10 years, it's like night and day, and it almost gives me a weird sort of hope that I hope that humanity looks back in 100 years, and I wonder if we're going to have a new form of helping people with disabilities and mental health that makes our current systems look like more Spartans kicking babies off cliffs, you know? Like, maybe one day we will grow supports enough to help those in society that need it, you know, with a 2 steps forward and 1 step back, as we always do, but maybe we'll make it.
Considering how our society has, how far or how not very far our society has come in the last, 1,000 years, I don't see it happening anytime soon, to be honest.
We have a globalized media network, which means we get all of the bad news of the world right in our face, but you have to look at the broader global statistics to kind of find the points of light. Like, violent crime worldwide has been dropping through the years. Medical care throughout the world has been improving and becoming more and more accessible. We don't always do the right thing, but we seem to painfully move in the right direction as time goes on, and that gives me hope that maybe we'll reach a better society that's more supportive of everybody.
Yeah, that would be nice if we eventually got to a utopian society.
Or hell, just a little more utopian. You know, we might not get to the aim for the moon, and even if you miss, you might land among the stars. Thank you for digging deep. This is a hard story to tell, but I think it's important. So thank you very much, She-Wolf.
No problem. And that is my episode for Occultae Veritatis. I am She-Wolf.
I'm Ood.
Postal Poet here.
This is Rocky.
I'm Rental.
Do some self-care, both for the listeners and the people who are here right now. Engage in something that makes you a little bit happy. Playing us out this somber episode is Lonesome and Sorry, a song full of regret about tragedy all on its own, from Ruth Edding. See you on the other side.
We were so happy, you and I. Why did we drift apart? I can't forget you, though I try. You're always in my heart. There's no one to console me when I'm blue. There's no one who can take the place of you. I'm lonesome and sorry because you went away. Lonesome and sorry, I miss you more each day. When nighttime comes stealing, I wonder how you're feeling. Are you lonesome and sorry? The same, dear, as me. Though you've been gone a little while, to me it seems like years. I have forgotten how to smile. My eyes are blind with tears. Our old-time friends all ask for you in vain. I always say that you'll be back again. I'm lonesome and sorry because you went away. Lonesome and sorry, I miss you more each day. When nighttime comes stealing, I wonder how you're feeling. Are you lonesome and sorry? The same, dear, as me. Are you lonesome and sorry? The same, dear, as me.
Just to cap off this episode, I'm reading an article suggested by She-Wolf, and it gives insight into somebody personally affected by this institution. Her brothers suffered abuse and neglect at Huronia Care Center. Now she's telling their story. The Huronia Regional Center in Ontario was sold to families as a safe home for children with disabilities, but in reality it was the site of widespread abuse and neglect. Now filmmaker Bari Cohen is taking her personal experience and shedding light on some of the survivors of that institution. Huronia was a government-run institution for children with developmental disabilities, located in Orillia, Ontario. It was shut down in 2009 after more than a century of operation. In 2013, the Ontario government reached a $35 million settlement in a class action lawsuit with former residents of the Huronia Regional Centre. But to this day, the center still affects those who live there as well as their families. Survivors of the center noted cage-like beds, as you heard in the episode, neglect by staff, as you heard in the episode, and poor living conditions, again as you heard. Cohen set out to learn about the brothers she didn't know about she had in the film Unloved Huronia's Forgotten Children. Keep your eye out for the release of that movie and the availability of that movie, because it has a lot of survivors speaking their own stories with their own words. The production is being shown at the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. She spoke with Matt Galloway on The Current about the documentary. What I know about my brothers is a little bit from what my late father has told me. He came to me one day when I was 12 and he said, "I buried a son today." And I was shocked. I thought, oh, it's one of my brothers. My God, what is he talking about? He said no. I had 2 sons from my first marriage. Of course, I knew about my sister Adele from that marriage, and we were relatively close, and I saw her often. I didn't know about these older brothers, these other brothers. And he talked about this one son, Alfred, that had died. And he said, in fact, I had another son as well. He didn't live that long. He was only 2 when he died at home. And that's all I really knew until the class action lawsuit settlement in December 2013. My sister Adele called me and said, "There's this settlement. Are we eligible to get any money?" And I said, "For what?" And she said, "Well, Alfred was at this place in Orillia, the Huronia Regional Center. At the time he was there, it was called Ontario Hospital School, and survivors had sued for gross abuses, negligence, and harm. They settled out of court. So I immediately started doing research on the class action lawyer's website. Read the plaintiff's statement of claim and other supporting documents, plus the statement, and I was floored. And that started me on the journey. Shortly after that, I was able to obtain their patient records. I would later find out in the course of research and making the film that our dad had lied and said that Lewis, who had died in 1957, and that he had died at home, that story wasn't true. He had actually gone to Huronia as well, when he was a little over 2 years old and then died. I think he was about 4 years old when he died. There was no love or care, very little stimulation. I don't think there was any, what we would conventionally call speech therapy or rehab or anything like that. They were left in their cot cages for hours on end. Alfred, as he got older, would have been herded into a television room after his meals, or left to play games that often involved kids hurting each other because staff themselves were bored, untrained, and would, based on evidence that was presented, based on plaintiff statements and what survivors have told me, they would often encourage sadistic play behavior among the kids. And one of the most tragic parts of all that is that this still happens. In some parts of the country, people are still being forced to live in institutions. This is to tee us all up to think about ways in which institution-like environments are still going on, creating harms, out of sight and out of mind, away from inspections. Since the pandemic alone, as we've seen, the appalling conditions of long-term care places has been revealed. And we do know that a lot of families who don't have enough direct funding to keep their loved ones at home or help them make independent living decisions on their own are compelled to put their kids, and not just kids, but older children and young adults, in long-term care places. Yeah, and just as She-Wolf said, I think it's important to think about the ramifications and the morality of some of the other institutionalized spaces that we still have in our society, up to and including long-term care homes, senior homes. Again, if you want to hear the full interview with the actual people actually talking with their meat mouths, and you can hear their vocal cords and all that stuff, look up, from The Current, filmmaker Barry Cohen examines Ontario's infamous Huronia Regional Center. And again, I encourage you to go look at the Remember Every Name website if you want to read all those stories directly. If this episode interests you at all, hearing the accounts in full length from the survivors themselves oftentimes is worth the read. But that's all we have for you this time. I hope the start of your November is going well, and we'll see you in 10 days for another episode of OVPOD. Night-night.